Berapa? Cukup 2 kan? Hah?
Apa?
Mik?
Main ke 2.
Yang 2 Kak.
20.
Belum ini.
Saya Kak.
Kemudiannya belum tahu.
Kupat terus. Belum ada bawah. Kamu dari
beda masuk ke kamu ada beda dia kan kamu atau kamu terus aku nah ini mas sih penyarian tembok yang lain ini juga sih karena kalau buat bikin modal sisinya ada rasisnya kayak ada terus orang fungsi
Terus
tapi aku nggak bisa lah kalau kita mau buat ini kecuali kan tadi yang paling cocok
Pak ini gimana?
kalau kemarin kan berarti kan aku masuk ke sini masalah tapi nggak ada buat permukaan yang beda jadi kalau ada ada di lagi berarti
Gitu lah ya.
itu aja
Cuma yang agak surat itu
kalau pada
halo. Sampai mana?
bentar ya
Sampai Makanya saya mau ikut kerja gitu.
apa tuh misalnya pembukaan sebenarnya
Jadi saya
cek ya
cek. Ini bagaimana ya? Ini ya.
udah bisa
Dalam soal sosial misalnya dalam situasi posisi perubahan normatif yang lebih makanya saya
kalau udah dari mana
jadi dia di posisi itu
Pas panasan sendiri. Kayak penampakan.
Tapi kalau cari apa yang
cek 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 satu cek cek one cek 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 coba cek cek satu cek 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 satu cek cek one cek 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 satu cek cek satu cek cek satu cek 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 satu cek
Masuk. Cek cek. Udah. Masuk. Cek cek. Udah. Masuk. Cek cek. Udah. Masuk. Cek cek. Udah.
giving ways like yeah. All right. So I guess the answer. Yes, yes. Yeah, but okay, so maybe I'm 16. Okay. Because otherwise you're like, okay, yes, yes, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Hey, Doria, we have to wait for Abubakar. Please don't share. Please don't make sense. Yeah. Oh, sure. Sure. All right. Yeah. He knows it. Yeah. It's hard to change. Yeah, I might be a bit difficult. It's just that yeah, that's why you can't get what you have to. It's better for you to have time. 45 or something. So the picnic that you get heavier. Yeah. So how? Um. Okay. I think we can start our program. Um. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Here we're meeting again in our Brownbag series number 62. As usual, if you have been here before, then you know I am Nia Deliana. I will be the moderator for today's session. So we have with us two scholars who are fellows. Yeah, the first one we have Professor Eby Hara, a compost fellow. He has been here for 3 months, almost 3 months, doing his research related to this title that he will be presenting in front of us, his preliminary findings. He is a professor in University of Jember. So yeah, he's a senior and has written numerous topics on international relations with the focus geography of Asia Pacific, the maritime fulcrums of Indonesia, and etc. The next one we have Doria, Thais Doria. I mean, like, yeah. So Thais is a fellow in East and West Islamic research institutions, new institutions under our university. So Thais is the first fellow over there, and she's also doing
field work in Indonesia for several weeks now, and she gonna gonna share with us the preliminary findings while being in Indonesia. So without further ado, I think we're gonna go first to our Professor Eby Hara. He will present for between 25 to 30 minutes, and then follow with the ties. Okay, the time is yours, Pak.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Leo, for the introductions. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon, friends. First of all, I'd like to thank the Compos for giving me opportunity to do research in UE3. Actually, my previous title of this presentation was Indonesia Foreign Policy Projection as a Middle Power. But I changed a bit the focus, so now the title is the continuity and discontinuity of national roles in middle power states, the case of Indonesia. So in this presentation, I will have several parts. We'll start with the introduction and then explain a bit about what is national role conception. Then I try to apply that concept to Jokowi's national role conception. And then I will explain the national role as a democracy promoter and national role as a global maritime fulcrums. And last one is conclusion. Now I move to the first part. This presentation aims to explain why national roles formulated by decision makers can continue or persist and others do not. There are two cases during President Jokowi era that I'm going to discuss. The first one is the continuations of Indonesian national role as a democracy promoter through the Bali Democracy Forum. So this role has been continuing from President Yudhoyono until Jokowi period. So there's a continuation. So it is quite interesting because Jokowi continue as Yudhoyono national roles. And the second case is the discontinuity of Indonesia's role as a global maritime fulcrums. This role as a global maritime power started by Jokowi in the first period of his presidency, but then he stopped promoting this role at his second period. So my argument is that this continuity and this continuity depend on three factors. So in my opinion, there are three aspects that makes the roles, the national role can continue and discontinue. The first factor is the level of shared view among elites, decision maker of the national roles. So it depends whether they have a strong agreement or they don't have. If they have, it's more likely that the roles can continue, but if we don't have the agreements, there is conflicting ideas, conflicting view on the national role. It's more likely that they will stop the national roles. And the second aspect is the support of the law from the institution, particularly from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the third factor that may contribute to the continuity or discontinuity of our national role is the external expectation to the roles from public, from masses, and from international communities. I will elaborate this argument later on, but now I want to explain a bit about. I forget to move this one. That's okay. So this is the arguments that I just mentioned. Now I move to the part on the concept. So I use the national role concept. The approach used is the concept of national role conception. National role conception contains shared view and expectation about the role and the purpose of a country in the international arena. It contains functions, position, and commitments. It is based on long experience. It also can motivate goals and action in foreign policies. So I also want to use the definition of national role conception by Hermans. This is quite interesting. According to him, there are two aspects of national roles: the ego part and the alter ego part. The ego part refers to the self expectation of the role holder, the self conceptualization of a state purpose by its leaderships. The alter ego part relates to the roles international institutions expect the role holders to act upon, affecting national foreign policy role conception. So, during the Jokowi era, the national role conception that I want to explain is the role as a promoter of democracy and the role of a global maritime power. So there had been shared vision and aspiration of becoming a promoter of democracy and of becoming a global maritime power to enhance Indonesia's maritime roles or status as a middle power state. And there has been critiques towards this concept. The critique is directed to the tendency to find a consensus about what the national role conception is in a country and the aspiration behind it. Often missing in the contestation is selecting national role and its resolution. So there is possibility of horizontal and vertical contestation in selecting national role conception. So a lot of writings on national role conception don't really look at the contestation happens in selecting or in choosing the national roles by decision makers. So attention to the contestation particularly important for seeing why one role continues and another stops. Now I try to implement this concept to Jokowi, to President Jokowi. From various activities and programs, Jokowi national role is based on economic interest. Many policies have to be based on transactional economic interest. So we can say that Jokowi national role conception was formulated to support that aspiration. This is stated in the concept of economic diplomacy. So when he supported a national role, the question of economic benefits always come up. And this is different from Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who did not focus on economic benefit only, but also on the projection of value. He enacted for main national role conception during his period to increase Indonesia roles on the global stage of the role, national role of voice for developing countries, regional leader and advocate of democracy, and a bridge builder. So this is taken from article written by Pak Faisal. Actually, Pak Faisal has many writing actually related to the role concept. Yeah, role theory. So I'm a bit afraid today actually because he's here. And so now I move to the case, the continuity and discontinuity of the national roles. As I explained, the role of democracy promoter during Jokowi era was is continued by the role of democracy promoted during Jokowi era was continued actually. This role was initiated by Yudhoyono, but then Jokowi continued this role. So it is quite interesting because considering Jokowi's national role conception mentioned above, because the role to promote democracy will not give benefit and economically actually, but still Jokowi continued this role. So there are several explanations for this based on my previous argument that I mentioned earlier. The first aspect is the shared views. So here there is a broad elite agreement on the role. It is also because the role is in accordance with the tradition of Indonesian middle power roles. This role was designed by Prime Minister Hassan Yuda at the time and continued by Marty Lagawa. And this national role provided space for Yudhoyono, who indeed wanted to play foreign policy roles. And the second aspect that contributed to the continuity of this program, there has been a support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to this role. The ministry make it a public diplomacy program that can raise Indonesia image. And also, there is tradition in Indonesia diplomacy of projecting values since the Asia-Africa conference. So they don't only want to promote the economic interest, but also promote values like dialogue, musyawarah. So this happened since the Asia-Africa conference in Bandung. And also another aspect that contributes to the continuity of national role as a democracy promoter is the external expectation. So Indonesian policies are often awaited by the international community. Promotion of democracy is in line with the wave of democracy in the world at the time. But I think the same expectation remains during Jokowi era, even though Indonesia democracy is in decrease in domestic politics. And the second case, the case of discontinuity, this is the case relating to the role as global maritime fulcrum. Global maritime fulcrum is a national role that was conceived during Jokowi time. So it was welcomed widely and enthusiastically by both Jokowi and the public at first. However, it was later abandoned in the second period of his government. Why this happened? Sorry, I forgot to move it. So this is the second case of discontinuity. There are three aspects, three factors, in my opinion, that can explain why Jokowi stopped these rules. The first aspect is shared views, is the same argument as the previous one, but here there is a contesting view to the role, to the global maritime fulcrum role. The initial idea of global maritime fulcrum came from Jokowi's advisor for the purpose of presidential campaign. So there was an assumption that this role was a good breakthrough and was indeed supported by Jokowi. However, not all significant elites were involved in the formulation because it was made before Jokowi was elected as president. So so there is a group of people, I think, who designed this role for Jokowi, and the main purpose at the time was uh, for the election. And when Jokowi elected as president, so he should fulfill this promise to promote global maritime program. But in its development, the elite began to disagree. Global Maritime Program initial mission was to restore the glory of Indonesia in the sea. However, this was contested by the elite itself amongst within the Jokowi government, whose national role conception saw transactional economic interest as a very important. So they start to think that GMF will not give a beneficial benefit economically for Indonesia. So they start to counter Susi Pujastuti idea to sink the illegal boat, illegal fishing. There's the certain group of elites, including Vice President at the time, Yusuf Kala, didn't agree with the sinking of illegal boat who still fish in Indonesian territory. So, and then the next aspect that contributed to the end of this role is because there's not much support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the role, to the implementation of GMF. And it was actually implemented by Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the coordinating Ministry of for Maritime Affairs. And also, GMF as a national role may change land paradigm in Indonesia to sea paradigm. The orientation to sea will completely change the long-standing orientation of land in Indonesian politics. And this will have many implications, especially in defense and development, which will harm many political interests. So I think there's a bit worry. If we focus on sea, then we will forget the land. And so far, the paradigm of developments and politics is the land paradigm, not based on sea. So there's a bit worry about this. So these three aspect doesn't exist. I mean, different from the aspect of rules to continue the national role to promote democracy. So that's why then at the end, in Jokowi's second terms, the GMF was ended. Jokowi sided with business group, which is in accordance with his national roles conception on economic diplomacy. So that is the cases. And now I think I move to the last part, the conclusion. So national role. So this is the additional reasons. And now I move to the last part, the conclusion. National role conception is a sufficient concept to explain continuity and change in foreign policy. Jokowi, for example, decided to end GMF because it did not match his role conception on economic diplomacy. However, Jokowi continued Bali Democracy Forum, continued the role to promote democracy. Although this is not matched to his national role conception, he has to compromise to alter ego or external expectation or alter expectation for his government to continue the roles. So that is my, I think, a bit short presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay.
Back floor to the.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Eby Hara. So we have listened briefly, about the the reason of continuity and discontinuity of Indonesia's foreign policy as middle power during the leadership of Jokowi, the examination that has been done by Prof. Eby Hara. And now I think we can go to Thais to deliver 25 to 30 minutes. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, time's yours. So you can see the board. What I'm doing.
So hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So pleasure to meet you, those that I don't. So let me introduce myself again. My name is Thais. You can call me Thai, just like Thai food. So it's easier, simpler. Today I'm sharing and presenting to you a little bit of my fieldwork or preliminary findings from my fieldwork in Indonesia, especially Jakarta. The title of the presentation is Navigating Global Hierarchies, the Foreign Policy Discourses of Intermediate States in the Global South. As mentioned before, I'm a PhD student at the University of Warwick in the UK, but I'm a fellow here, luckily, and I'm thankful for that. So let's dive into the presentation. So I have structured the presentation today quite academically so I'm sorry about that. I hope it's not too boring. But I will begin by introducing the topic and the motivations for my research. I will tell you about what research questions I'm trying to answer today, specifically not in my PhD, the methodology that I've used so far, what are some of my preliminary findings and how I aim to contribute to the field of international relations, and some of my concluding remarks. Um, so by way of introduction, my research, this presentation today is part of my PhD. My PhD analyzes and compares Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia's foreign policy discourses. So, giving a step back, the motivation to do so was I am graduated in IR. I did my master's in IR, and I'm doing my PhD in IR. And most of IR theories, they are based in great power politics and great power relations, great power interests. So, in a sense, they are really great power centric. And many times they extrapolate from these major powers' experience to try to explain other realities. And my point is that they cannot really account and predict behavior from other countries if they're expecting to behave in the same way as major powers, because these countries have different histories and different background, different preoccupations, and different constraints. So that was the motivation for my research. What I'm really trying to do is sort of go beyond the binary of dominant and subordinate powers and try to give a little bit of nuance and understand what I call intermediate states in the global south, hence Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia. And the reason I chose three different regions is because, again, mainstream IR theories often argue that countries in similar positions will have similar behavior. And I want to make the point that maybe these three countries are in similar positions, but the fact that they are in different geographies, they have different histories, although shared history in some sense of colonialism. Um, this also play a factor in their foreign policy discourses and behavior. So, in a sense, it's to showcase the complexity, both the similarity and the difference of the so-called global South. Um, so that's the first part. Then the research focus on these three countries. The puzzle, I'm gonna present it to you. So for today, I'm focusing specifically on the preliminary findings from Indonesia and from the interviews in Jakarta. I have interviewed so far 21 people from the foreign policy community. This means former ministers of foreign affairs, diplomats, journalists, think tanks, scholars, name it. I'm interviewing anyone that is open to it. And I'm trying to address these three questions on the interviews. So, how does Indonesia or Indonesia's foreign policy community perceive itself in the global order? Does it see itself as a middle power? Does it see itself as a regional leader? Does it see itself as a global south developing emerging economy and so on and so forth? How does Indonesia view the global order? Is it an anarchic international order? Is it a hierarchical international order? Is it a multipolar international order? Is it unipolar? Is it bipolar? And so on and so forth. What strategies and concepts emerge to position itself, hence Indonesia? For instance, Bebas active. Is Bebas active a concept that is used beyond the constitution and discourses? Is it actually formulated and materialized in policies? Or is it just an umbrella of that you can actually feed almost anything? So to do that, the methodology I use is qualitative content analysis. Basically, I use the software called MaxQGA, and I upload all the data that I have there. The data meaning the interviews, but also before the interviews, I analyzed 200 speeches from Indonesia from 1998 until 2022. And the reason why I decided to start with the secondary data, meaning the speeches and reports and white paper, was because I wanted to have a more tailored and informed interview to get most out of it. And then I mix after doing the interviews, that's the next part that I haven't done so far. I will try to triangulate the interviews with the speeches I analyzed before to check and see if public discourse and private, in a sense, in the talk with me is different or whether they converge. The reason why I chose this method, qualitative content analysis, it's because it's inductive, meaning I do not impose any theoretical framework into the data. I don't start by looking at words like, do they say middle power? Do they say Bebas active? What I do is I read all documents at once and then get a sense of what themes emerge the most. Are they talking more about development? Are they talking more about security? Are they talking more about economic diplomacy? And then I start to categorize passages of each document to these themes. And in the end, I can compare how often it appears, what develop means, what Bebas active means, what Bebas active means in different periods of time. And yeah, so that's the reason why I do qualitative content analysis. So now let's jump into the fun part. So this is some of my preliminary findings so far, and this is only from the interviews. This is not related to the speeches I analyzed before. So this is only based on 21 interviews that I had so far. One thing that is actually quite striking to me, as I said before, I was looking into how Indonesia sees itself, how it sees the global order. But one thing that I was not looking into and appeared in every interview was what I call a shared historical narrative. That is, almost all the interviews, I started with really open questions. For example, tell me a little bit about your career. What do you think about Indonesia foreign policy? And as soon as I asked that, every single one gave me a short history of Indonesia foreign policy from Sukarno, Suharto, Megawati, and it was exactly the same. They used the same terms. They describe the presidencies in the same way. So there was this idea of not necessarily continuity, but I find it interesting that these people, they have diverging views, they have diverging positions, and still they have a similar perspective on what happened in the past in terms of Indonesia foreign policy. Divergences only start to happen when we start to talk about Jokowi onwards. Even the beginning of Jokowi, it's still pretty much the same. And then they start to differ in the assessment of how to interpret Indonesia's foreign policy. So, for instance, they would say things like SBY was more idealist, Jokowi was more pragmatic when they were being complementary. When they were not being complementary, they would say things like transactional, or he didn't care about foreign policy. So there was this shared perspective, and they would talk about in the past Indonesia was more assertive, but that had a certain cost to Indonesia. So that is one of my findings, and I find it really interesting that somehow everybody agrees to what happened to Indonesia before, but now they might have different interpretation of what is going on. And related to that, and these are the two findings on your left, I also asked, how would you describe Indonesia's foreign policy identity? And although they wouldn't disagree on that, they would highlight different aspects of Indonesia's foreign policy identity. So, for example, some would highlight that Indonesia is a majority country and that sometimes might play a role in how Indonesia sees foreign policy. Although others would argue otherwise. For example, it is a Muslim majority country, but it's not a Muslim country, so there is a difference there. Others would say that Indonesia is a middle power, as just presented here. It actually ties really well with the previous presentation. But middle power actually is a term that brought quite divergence in my interviews. And interestingly, most of the scholars like the term. I think my sense is that they have a more complex perspective of what middle power means in a sense. So it's more a perspective of how it positions in international system, what it can do in terms of diplomacy, how it can translate diplomacy into national gains. Whereas policymakers, I have a sense that they have a different understanding of middle power. For example, Paki Natalegawa, and I'm only speaking that because he allowed me to, mentioned to me that he was when he was minister, he would talk about middle power quite often. But now he doesn't really like the term, and he's quite public about that because he has a sense that now the term sort of limits what Indonesia can achieve and where Indonesia can go. So some policy makers or former minister in this case, they see that the term itself seems to leave Indonesia in the middle, whereas Indonesia can achieve much more than that. What they highlight is that even if Indonesia becomes a great power in a sense, what we must be careful about is not to transform our policies into great power policies. Um, then again, it's a different understanding from the scholarship, because a scholarship, if you become a great power, by definition, you have great power policy. So it's slightly different, and that's interesting because it's interesting to see how concepts navigate different spheres. So the political sphere and the academic sphere do not necessarily share the same meaning of concepts. And then what I found that some things that might diverge in my interview. So this side is more what they had in common, and that side is more what some interviews disagree. So the role of ASEAN, for example. So ASEAN came up as part of Indonesian identity, or at least being a Southeast Asian country. But when I asked about, do you think that Indonesia should play a leadership role in ASEAN, or should it be like how it is, consensus building? And that's where disagreements would emerge, because some argue that Indonesia seems to be afraid to take positions, and that shows weaknesses. If Indonesia were more assertive in the matters of South China Sea, for example, it would have more respect from outside powers. Others would argue the exact opposite, that the strength of Indonesia is in being able to hear and not necessarily try to lead by imposition, so to speak. They would also disagree on what centrality should ASEAN play in Indonesia's foreign policy. Actually, many interviewees told me, do you know, we cannot choose our neighbors, so we have to work with what we got, showing a certain sense of, you know, discontent with what they got. So it's like, just do what you have to do, but don't do more than that. And others would say exactly the opposite. Like, I think we should do more than what we are doing. Because, for example, just this morning in one interview, the interviewee told me that the geopolitical scenario is increasingly hostile, especially in relation to the US, China. And he told me that from previous experience, he knows that we, Indonesia in that case, cannot rely on major powers. So we should be really active in building a regional order and being cohesive in that regional order. Otherwise, when the US China rivalry increases even more, especially with Trump now, Indonesia will have no one to recall to, and will not have a cohesive region to fight against potential sanctions and so on. Another question that I would ask was, what do you think are some of Indonesia's underexplored strengths? So things that Indonesia has the potential to be a leader, or if not a leader, to be at least more active, but it isn't. For example, energy transition. That came up in many interviews. Many interviewees think that Indonesia could be more active in regional and multilateral forums in advocating for energy transition and climate change issues, so environmental issues. Others would argue that Indonesia had a greater role to play with Muslim countries, that it could do, that it could have greater ties with these countries and sort of build coalitions to advocate for specific issues. Others would argue that I'm trying to think of another example. Then they would mention, for example, again, ASEAN. Others would argue that Indonesia has the potential to be a greater leader in ASEAN, but it isn't. So it's interesting because a really diverse range of answers appear in this unrealized strategic potential. And that plays out to one of my first conversations that I had here, actually on my very first day, when someone told me that Indonesia punches below its weight. The subtest there is that it has more weight that it could punch. So it has a lot of unrealized potential that it could transform into capability. So what contributions I'm trying to make with this research? So first is a theoretical contribution. So the idea is, and my aim is to expand a little bit the field of IR theory. And for that, I'm using global IR as an approach to my research. And try to overcome this idea that countries are either dominant or subordinate, are either major powers or middle and smaller countries, and try to give a little bit of nuance to what it means to be a middle power, for example, what it means to be a regional leader, what it means specifically, and most importantly, I think, for these countries themselves. So I'm not trying to use like IR jargon to describe the countries, but use the jargons that the countries use to inform IR. So then the methodological contribution that I'm trying to make is I have gathered 24 years of data for Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia in terms of presidential speeches, Minister of Foreign Affairs speeches, reports, white papers, and the interviews. And the way I'm doing the research on the software, this is going to be all be able to be replicable outside the interviews because I will not be able to make them public. But the documents for sure because they are publicly available on the official websites. And then as well, the conceptual contribution that I'm trying to make is to understand the terms and concepts these three countries uses to leverage their positions in global hierarchies. So, for example, Indonesia quite often use bebas active, which I can talk more about on the Q&A. But what does it mean, really? Because it's never really described what it is. It's just say free and active, and then everybody can sort of interpret as they wish. But is it really so? Or is there a continuity in these terms? So that's the conceptual contribution that I'm trying to make. And then I'm hoping to be able to talk to the policy sphere and have a more practical contribution. But this is wishful thinking, I think. So you can take that out. So my concluding remarks about my preliminary findings of Indonesia's foreign policy so far. Again, the period of 1998 and 2022. So one thing that I've noticed, of course, I knew that before by reading papers about Indonesia, but one thing that I've noticed from the interviews and the way people describe Indonesia's foreign policy is that it's not only president-centered, but it's overly president-centered in a sense. So just today, someone was telling me how foreign policy is elaborated in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they told me, we have a constitution, we have 5 principles in the constitution that we have to abide to, for instance, Bebas Active, but it's also a mandate of the president. So it's one in line with the other. And this, in a sense, and that's my assessment now, not the interviews, this, in a sense, hinders Indonesia's potential to play a cohesive or continuous role, if you wish, in terms of foreign policy in certain issues. And this is not only because it is president mandated, this is true for most countries. But in the case of Indonesia, it seems that there's not much consultation of what the foreign policy should be. It's just sort of elaborate and you have to abide by it. And it's also true, and another weaknesses of this, not necessarily being president centered, but one thing that I just thought about yesterday from an interview is the way the Ministry of Foreign Affairs work here. The postings are not necessarily related to the diplomat's expertise. So, for example, quite often, before doing the interviews, I would read into the person that I'm interviewing, of course, and I would see, for example, let's say Thais. Thais, Indonesian diplomat. She was posted to Rome to talk about environmental issues. The following year, she was in Italy, no, not Italy, in Germany, talking about um, weapons of mass destruction. Then she was talking about the World Trade Organization. So how can a diplomat really build the expertise in each issue area and have the bargaining power in negotiations if they are negotiating with much more experienced diplomats from other counterparts? Not that they don't know about it, but they are just not able to sort of build that knowledge throughout their career because they change so much in terms of issue area. This is only an exception in those that have a background in law. Those that have a background in law seem to be on related positions throughout their career. Otherwise, it changes quite a lot. Then comparative insights. This is still ongoing, so I don't have a lot to talk about it. But it's interesting to see that, for example, before coming here, I expected to see more similarities between Brazil and Indonesia in terms of foreign policy because our ministries are somewhat similar in how they work. You have to do an exam to become a diplomat, and then you build your career, and then usually you have a minister of foreign affairs that is a career diplomat, but it is extremely different somehow. And this, I think, is because I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil has access to more budget, more funding that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia has. And also because of what I just said about being posted to things that you're not necessarily an expert in. In Brazil, you are always posted to the same sort of issue, not the same place, but it doesn't matter wherever you go. If you are a diplomat specializing in finance, you are going to be posted in London, Brazil, UK, London, Germany, to talk about finance. You're not going to be posted to talk about food security, for example. And in regards to South Africa is the one that I expect to be more different than the other two, because South Africa diplomacy is actually politically appointed. So they change quite a lot the diplomatic corps depending on what or who the president is. And finally, this is something that I find quite striking in the case of Indonesia, in that I'm still trying to make sense of it. So I really welcome feedback, suggestions, questions, whatever you have in mind. I have a sense that in Indonesia, there is a not clear distinction, but everything seems to be related to national interests. So, for example, just now, Indonesia has claimed the intention to join the BRICS. And then all the discussions seems to be whether this is good or bad for Indonesia in terms of national interests. It seems to me that the discussions are always tied to economic benefits from Indonesia, how much money it can bring home, but it doesn't see the benefit beyond that. For example, participate in these forums and be able to have bilaterals with the countries of these forums, be able to build coalitions to advance policies that Indonesia advanced. For example, now in the case of Prabowo, to talk about food security and how to relate food security to his policy of combating poverty at home. So it seems to me that it's always nationally oriented in a sense that there isn't a distinction between national and international. So I will finish here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Thais. That is a really interesting presentation. So we can see from the both presentation there is kind of similarity in terms of gathering, examining public opinions on on Indonesia's position, in international politics or arena. Yeah, so because this is Philo's presentation, so I think I would like to give priority first to ask question or giving feedback, comment from our lecturers. We can take first questions from Pak Jayadi. Who else gonna go? Okay, yeah, I think we can. Okay, Pak Faisal. Okay, let's go with the two questions first. Sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, moderator. I have one question for each. For Thais, maybe 1.5 question. Prof. Eby Hara, your case on the discontinuity, the GMF, right? GMF is Global Maritime Fulcrum, not Garuda Maintenance Facility, right? You said that one of the issue that leads to the discontinuity of this case is because of the lack of shared views, right? Among the significant elites. Can you spell out more on who are they, the significant elites that you mentioned? What kind of significant elites that do not or does not share this view that makes this GMF discontinued? If you can enlighten us more. To Thais, thank you for the presentation again, very enlightening. I just want to know more about. You said that your preliminary finding is based on the 21, right? Interviews. Could you also explain a bit more on who are those those interviews? What are the backgrounds they have? Do you concern also with a kind of representativeness of them in terms of sharing the Indonesian views or perspective on foreign policy? That is one question. The half question is that to what extent do you think, if any, 1.5. to to what extent do you think that the general public play roles in the formation or in the views on Indonesian foreign policies in general? Thank you. So it is 1.5, Pak Dekan.
Thank you, Pak Jayadi, for the difficult questions. Actually, so yeah, the contesting view, in particular, I think happened with regard to the. It's not directly to the GMF, but to the Susi Pujastiti policies to sinking the boats, actually, because their policies reduce the fish productions there are certain parts in Indonesia where the production of fish decreased very much. And at the time, I think, including Vice President Yusuf Kala, and also Pak Luhut, said that Ibu Susi need to stop this policy actually. So that is the what's that different views, I think, with regard to the game app, to the global multi-fulcrum. I don't know the different views with regard to other policy, other programs, but the thing that I found in some writings, there is quite a lot of debate with regard to the Ibu Susi policy on sinking the boats. Actually, yeah. I will find out other information with regard to the different views to the game app. Yeah.
Satisfying, Pak Jai? It's okay. Okay. Go.
Okay, so maybe approach the first question about the diversity of the people that I'm interviewing. It ranges from journalists, for example. I interview, I said 21, but actually it was more than 40, but that I actually took notes was 21, because some interviews I wanted to be more informal so people could be really opened. For instance, at Compass, I had a whole afternoon with 10 journalists from the international desk. So basically the whole team. And then also the Jakarta Post. And I interview schoolers from different backgrounds, IR, IPE. And then I was lucky to interview most of the former foreign ministers. And then I interviewed diplomats in different positions. So these that are, for example, in multilateral institutions like the UN, these that are here, some that are more into the law background, women, because gender also plays a role in the hierarchy inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's interesting to see different perspectives in that regard, related to not only the position the person is, but the gender. So in a sense, I'm quite happy with the diversity of my interviews. And also, I also interview some representatives from the Foreign Policy Commission of Majelis Ulama Indonesia, so MUI, because I also wanted to have like diverse background on how Indonesians, or at least how Indonesia foreign policy community sees Indonesia and Indonesia's role in the world. Regarding the second question about whether, and if so, to what extent the public plays a role in Indonesia foreign policy, my sense is that not really, but not necessarily because it cannot play a role, but mostly because it's not that interest. So governments have sort of more leeway to deal with foreign policy without really have an oversight of the population as regards to foreign policy. But I can think of exceptions. For example, I wouldn't argue that doesn't matter. Let's think about Palestine. If a president in Indonesia says, you know what, I'm going to recognize Israel, I don't see that playing out, so I wouldn't argue that the public doesn't play a role, but maybe it's more subtle, and the president or the bureaucracy has more leeway to deal with foreign policy than maybe with other issues.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Nidel. I have one question each for the presenter. I think I'll start with Thais. So basically, the way how you frame the paper or the thesis is basically you want to contribute to the discussion of global hierarchy, right? I think it reminds me of writings of Aisy Zarakol on the hierarchy in world politics, in which she mentioned about hierarchy as an institutionalized functional bargaining. So basically, is a function of trade-off, right? Or perhaps hierarchy as a logic of positionality. Basically, it's more about power instead of a logic of trade, or perhaps it's more about productive space. Basically, it was being produced. Hierarchy is not something fixed. It's not something that it's uh, uh, continual, but more about being shaped by social and political environment, and so on and so forth. So I kind of want you to tease a little bit how these three so-called intermediate state view hierarchy. What logics underpin the way how they view logic? Are you trying to create, build upon whatever research you're doing, a new kind of a logic in which you can contribute? So this is what other people have been discussing about hierarchy, and I think from the Indonesian case, from South African and Brazil, they have their own kind of a logic. Is it something that you want to pursue, providing more a contribution toward the literature, or it just like, what are they talking about hierarchy? I think it will be interesting to conceptualize new kind of a logic, if any, definitely, from this intermediate state and how they view hierarchy. I think that's my question for Pak Prof. Eby Hara. I think it's really interesting about talking about discontinuity, right? Because sometimes when we talk about national role conception, usually people focus on the agency of the state, or the agency of the so-called culture identity. So in fact, even the president, even though they do have an agency, they are being very much constrained by the historical narrative, for instance, the identity they are being part of. For instance, I don't think Widodo can push the idea of free Palestine because it's part of the narrative of Indonesian role conception. But in your case, sometimes they do, right? Sometimes they try to break out. But is it really break out, or is it just because the GMF, as you mentioned, is not something that it's embedded into our national role concept? It's not really a role conception. It's just a policy. In fact, it died before it born, something like that. So my question is, how can you really view or conceptualize the agency of presidents in, to some extent, discontinued a particular role conception? Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we can go with Thais first. Yeah.
So thank you, Faisal. In a sense, you answered the question for me. So somehow, thank you. So basically, you mentioned this paper from Zarakol and Martin, where they give three. It's more like a literature review paper. Honestly, they are not proposing what global hierarchy means, but they have a look at international relations scholarship and categorize global hierarchies according to three different scholarships, as Faisal just mentioned. So one would be positionality. There are smaller countries, middle countries, and great countries. So it's about position where you are in terms of material capabilities. The other one would be more productive, like it would be somewhat related to constructivist IR, which is like in accepting your position, you are reinforcing your position in a sense. So you are productive of the place you are, as well others are. So hierarchy happens in interactions, in relations. It's not a structure, but it's a relational condition. In order to have one at the bottom, there needs to be one at the top, in a sense. So all these ideas about global hierarchies in IR, and there are really many, and I really follow up on them and try to dialogue with them. They, however, they never really consider the agency of countries in the global south. So even though they consider positionality and the fact that some countries might react to hierarchies or accept hierarchies, they don't consider the role that countries in different positions play in reinforcing the hierarchy itself. So my idea, and this depends on the interviews and the data, really, I cannot come up with that, is to see how these three cases understand the global order hence global hierarchies. And if these understandings fit within any of the IR scholarship, or actually is quite, in a sense, unique. So, and also what factors play into their understanding. Again, the reason why I chose these three countries is because according to IR, they are in the same positionality. So I can always already discard one of the ideas of hierarchy as positionality, because these three countries have different understandings of hierarchy. For example, for Brazil, the international order isn't really, we can talk about multipolarity, multiplex world order, and so on, and that's interest, and some diplomats in Brazil do. But for most Brazilian diplomats, they see the international order really through the lenses of different issue areas, and they know in which issue areas Brazil has the capability to play a bigger or not so big of a role, and they really focus on that. So, for example, Brazil really tries to play a role in terms of food security, not so. Also, World Trade Organization. A Brazilian diplomat was the president of the World Trade Organization for 10 years, so it has built a lot of expertise on that. In regards to Indonesia, it seems to be different. It seems to look at the world through the region. For example, Brazil doesn't have a regional identity as Indonesia has. In every interview, everybody will talk about Indonesia be a Southeast Asian country. In no interview in Brazil, someone will say we are a Latin American country. So we don't have a regional identity as Indonesia has. So I have a sense that Indonesia sees the international order through the lenses of the regional order. So that, in a sense, is already different. And yes, that's what I'm trying to do, hopefully, with the research.
Okay. Thank you, Faisal, for the questions. I think there are 2 points here. The first one with regard to whether GMF is a policy or a national conception, national role conception. I think there is an aspiration to become a maritime power. So if we say like that, so probably it can be a national role conception. So there's an aspiration to be a maritime power. So, and yeah, I'm not sure about GMF, whether it's a policy or not, but if we talk that we have an aspiration to be a maritime power, then it can be as a considered as a national role conception. Yeah. And the second thing, so actually, I don't know the answer. How the president as an agency can do something, or how to conceptualize that. I have no idea about that, because I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can go to.
Yeah. Okay. This is a follow-up from Pak Jayadi's earlier question. It's back to methods and your use of interviews. At one point just now, you said that you address the question of how representative your interviewee base can be, right? And so whether it's a 10 or 50 or 100 or whatever, but there's one actor in this that doesn't change. That's the interviewer, right? And so I'm raising this not specific to you, but I think I'm raising this as a question that all academics have to face, right? So how do you deal with your own subject position as the person asking these questions? This is part and parcel of the kind of work that we do, especially when our work involves getting direct information through interviews. So you interviewing them will be very different from me interviewing them, right? So how do you take that and how do you address that? That's one. Related to that then is, again, going back to the question of whether the public plays a role in this. Now, again, I'm not disagreeing with the approach and the method that you take, and I think it's perfectly valid to do what you've done. However, again, in the process of trying to answer a question like, okay, who determines foreign policy? How is foreign policy determined by these actors? The primacy we give to political actors and agents, isn't there always this attendant risk, right? That we afford them more agency than they have. On the one hand, then you discount the public. The public doesn't play that much of a role, but there's also a deeper question. And sometimes I feel that some developing countries actually don't have freedom in terms of their foreign policy. We choose what we have at hand. At any given point in time, the range of options that we have is finite. And there are some things that we can't do. Simple as that. Even if we wanted to, we can't. You give the example yourself. Can Indonesia recognize Israel? No, it's not going to happen. It will never happen. Not now, right? So what freedom is there? Because this question of freedom is linked to the whole point of agency. And we need to address that, because your counting of the thing you're looking at involves human agency at the center of it. Yeah. So because foreign policy doesn't drop from the sky, it's a human construct. There are agents and actors involved. So again, this is not specific to your work, but I think this is an important question because we have a lot of young scholars here. So I'm really interested. How do you deal with this? What's your take, and how do you deal with these questions? Because these are all questions in our field, as you know, right? But how do you personally deal with this? I'm very interested in hearing that.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah. So we got two questions over there. Yeah. To respond about methodology. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For example, you mentioned the order of this. I may give you like the historical narrative from right? So, does, for instance, this foreign policy community have a difference one time to the other? If that is the case, right? So your foreign policy community will have to be also different, right? And the next question will be, if that is different, then do you believe that the view that you got now from this 21 view can really represent that kind of foreign policy? So I think at least if you can address that as well, it will be a very, very, a very good, at least contribution to this. When I'm asking, when I'm teaching you about the representativeness, I'm not thinking it in a quantitative way, no, because I understand that you are doing it in politics. But I read a book written about, I think, Nigeria. The book is called Democracy in Translation. This guy, Frederick Silver, is doing qualitative interviews to 100 people. But he was concerned also with the so-called representativeness. Although he's doing a semi-structured qualitative interviews. And he can justify that these 100 people can also be considered as the representative of the whole possible different views about Nigerians, both elite and not elite, when they are talking about what democracy means to them, for instance. But that's what I'm trying to get at, even for
Yeah. I mean, you got this is like question, but also recommendation to look further.
Yeah.
Just yeah. I mean, you can take.
I will answer in a way not trying to defend myself, but I'm actually really thankful for the suggestions and the feedback. So my personal bias, that for sure, that's something that even my university ethical review asks me to reflect on. So by obligation, I will have a chapter on that. where I come from, what I think, how is my background, how this influenced my interviews, what do I understand of the international order, and how this plays out in my interview. And that's something that I cannot be neutral about it. Doesn't matter my method. And doesn't matter that I'm trying to be as transparent as I can in terms of the methods. People will have access to it. People will have access how I come up to this conclusion that development for Indonesia means this or that. They will know why I made that assumption, but still I made that assumption. For sure, you would make different conclusions from the same documents. And the way that I try to mitigate sometimes is I build, for example, same structured interviews with a committee of 10 professors in my university to have a sense if the questions that I'm asking are really related to the questions I'm asking in my thesis. So in a sense, I sort of repeat these questions over the interviews. At the same time, I try to tailor some questions to the interviewee so they feel flattered, of course, that I looked into them before. Regarding freedom, I both agree and disagree. In a sense, developing countries have so many constraints in terms of what they can really do in terms of international, even national policy. To be fair, but for example, we do have freedom. Indonesia can or cannot join the BRICS is a choice. Indonesia can or cannot emphasize food security or trade or weapons of mass destruction. It does shape its own agenda. So there are many spaces for freedom, so to speak. And for me, freedom in the sense is about choice, and it has choice to play in some instance. Of course, it cannot do as it wish. For example, during Pak Hassan without Yuda term, he tried to build an East Asia community because he felt that East Asia could have its own understanding of democracy. But it didn't gain traction in the region. So there is the limit of what he can do. In terms of foreign policy community, what it means, I use more academic term of foreign policy community. It's not my own understanding. It's more to say, for example, if I were to ask you the question, who are the actors that shape and formulate Indonesia's foreign policy? You would answer, I don't know, maybe the media, maybe the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, mostly the president. So these are the people that I'm trying to interview, the people that somehow could influence the shape of Indonesia's foreign policy. And that's what I understand by foreign policy community. If I'm reaching saturation, to speak in technical terms, meaning if I will get all possible assessments of Indonesia's about Indonesia foreign policy, I would certainly argue that I do in terms of my viva. But personally, I don't think so. I mean, but at the same time, it's not about saturation, because what I'm trying to do already is to shed light in mainstream IR theories and say, hey, I know you have these ideas about the global order, but there are also these other ideas. This does not resume Indonesia to these ideas. Actually, it makes Indonesia great in influencing international ideas. It's not about all options that we have inside Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you. I mean, like, your views has been, yeah, you have answered the questions, and probably you know by now like what to do next. Pak Eby and Thais too. Okay. Hey, I know there is one more question you haven't answered. He said, but I would suggest that to. Yes, I mean, like, because we've got to give question for students. There is only 7 minutes left. Okay, let me check. Let me check first. Students, any of you want to ask? Alamshah and yes. So what can we do? You okay? Make it short. Your question, so we can have some more time for our dean to give his opinion. Okay?
Actually, my question is directed to Miss Doria, if I'm not mistaken. You have mentioned that you try to make a comparison of more than three countries: Indonesia, Brazil, and and South Africa, right? So my question is, as you mentioned, like in Indonesia, the foreign policies are basing on the economic interests, but you didn't mention like other countries. Like how about Brazil? How about South Africa? And how do they connect to your thesis? That's my question. Thank you.
All right, I think you can take that. Yeah, thank you. Your name again? Doto. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for your question. So, I mean, in a sense, this is a shared idea in developing countries, but it's different what degree. For example, South Africa, because it has the history of apartheid since 1994, it tries to direct and be a champion in terms of human rights foreign policy. Hence, the case against Israel in the ICC. So in order to rebuild its own image, it tries to focus on human rights in terms of foreign policy. You don't see the same in Indonesia, for example, or Brazil for that matter. Brazil also really cares about economic diplomacy for sure, but I think sometimes Brazil is more assertive, and this is not necessarily a good thing. um, in its foreign policy, for example, it tried to mediate the case of Tehran during the Obama presidency. So sometimes Brazil meddles in other people's issues. So in a sense, it is also preoccupied with economic diplomacy, but it also is more adventurous in its foreign policy. Let's put it this way.
Thank you. Yeah, we take. I think Alam Shah should go first.
Thank you. My name Alamsa from FOS. My question is, if we talk about the middle power, we talk also about great power. And my question is, to what extent transnational advocacy in great power determine or influence the concept of middle power by Indonesia as you finding? Thank you.
Again, I'm not sure whether I can answer the questions. So this the role of transnational advocacy networks yet. How do they can move one country from middle power to determine of the concept of middle power? Okay. Yeah. It's also difficult things for me to answer. Transnational advocacy network. So, what is the examples of that networks? May you explain to me, probably? Okay. 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 Yeah, I think yeah, it's something that has not been discussed related to the concept of middle power. Middle power discussed more with the position of that state, actually the aspiration to be middle power, aspiration to be a great power. So that, and sometimes it's more to do with the economic aspect or military aspect. So this value, like human rights, is something that need to be considered when as well when you want to be a middle power or to be a major power. I think Indonesia as well during Pak SBY try to use democracy, I think, as a value, but he want to promote Indonesian values with regard to democracy to be not sure whether to be a great power or middle power, but just to make an image that Indonesia is active involving in promoting democracy. So I'm not sure whether it relates to the concept of middle power or not.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks.
I'm not sure that I understood your question. Let me try to. Is it that you're asking if if we should take into account transnational network and non-state actors to understand middle power and great power concept?
Yes, that's it.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see.
Like what? I mean, like what is the institution? Do you know? What is the institution that's transnational network that you mentioned? United Nations. Okay, okay.
So,
I mean, yeah. I mean,
so you're saying that
so the external factors to the yeah
like external actors trying to influence Indonesian perspective.
yeah something yeah like that.
To be honest, I don't know quite much about that,
Okay.
but I would say that it's not as significant in terms of the middle power concept itself, because there are many Indonesian scholars, including in this room, that works with the concept. They're not related to
All right.
transnational
Okay.
networks. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Ice. I think we should go next. Okay. But I think we should go to you first. Just you can give your opinion.
Thank you. In the beginning, you were mentioning you want to understand the behavior of this middle power, and then there are a lot of literature on middle power. And although it's a work in progress, I want to know how your work would be differ from Richard Higgett's relocating middle powers about Australia and Japan in the 1980s, and how do you see how far it is in your research for you to come up with a new definition or some kind of preliminary conclusion on what are the behaviors of these three countries, at least Indonesia, based on the understanding coming from your interviews. Are we different from previous middle powers in the 80s and the 70s, like what Richard Higgett, studied back then, and others as well?
Okay, so that's tricky one. I mean, I'm not necessarily trying to reconceptualize middle power or what middle powermanship means, but if these countries use the concept to begin with, from these three countries, Indonesia is the only one that used the concept of middle power. South Africa did use a few times, not in the political sphere, in the academic sphere. So Brazil does not use middle power at all, because the academic community understand middle power to be a Western concept. So they would say like global South, developing country, emerging country. And Indonesia, this is more preeminent so. But much to my surprise, it's actually being discussed inside Indonesia. And for example, last week there was the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia conference, and Pak Dino is one that really tries to push the agenda of middle power and what middle power means. In that sense, I think his understanding, I won't say the foreign policy community, but his understanding is really in line with middle powers from the 80s and for today, So, but I'm not sure it is translated into the policy sphere. For example, anecdote that I can tell about it because they allowed me to is Pak Jokowi, when he was president, then the Minister of Foreign Affairs and other were to explain to him, in your discourses, sometimes you may use middle power because Indonesia is a middle power. And then he answered, how come? We are such a big country. We are a big power. So it could not fit his mind that Indonesia is a middle power because it didn't make sense to him to be a big country and a middle power. I didn't really answer your question, but that's what I have so far.
Right. I think the time is pointing to end. For student, like if you have extra question, I think you can meet Thais after the session. And you too, Farish Nur. Yeah, yeah. So right. So to conclude, our two presentation today, that is it seems like it speak to each other, right? Prof. Eby Hara talking about continuity and discontinuity, looking from the role of the elites and then the institutions and then the public opinions, seem like Thais, trying to look at the perspective, the images of Indonesians people about how they see themselves at the international arena. So this is still ongoing. Both of them using qualitative methodology. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, like, good luck with your research. We are looking forward to, the final version of this. Congratulations.